Yeah? Right?
Yes.
Deal?
Boing.
Welcome to the Acquia Podcast, Drupal technology, community, and business.
Welcome to the Acquia Podcast, Drupal technology, community, and business.
There's a module for that?
Of course there is.
So, welcome to Jam's virtual Drupal camp. Ronald, Ashri is with me, and we're going to talk about content strategy. Ronald is the CTO of BlueSpark Labs, and he did this session in Austin at Drupal camp. Is that right?
That's correct.
Cool, and I thought it was pretty neat, and I thought we should, I wanted to see it because I didn't have time to see it, and I think it's a great resource for people. So we're going to post this on acquia.com. Yeah, there's going to be a big page with a podcast interview video and the session and all your slides and all the links and stuff we talked about. So I'm going to hand it over to you. You turn on your slides, tell us what you're talking about today, and yeah, here we go. Ronald, Ashri.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk about content strategy and Drupal site building and how the two things connect. And let me just kind of very quickly explain how I arrived at feeling the need to talk about these things. So as BlueSpark, we build sites for clients, obligatory example sites that we build for clients here. And they tend to be large organizations with a number of interested parties that need to think about how they're going to create content for their sites. And we also build our own products, and actually we need to think about how we're going to promote our products. So the two products we have is Roomify, which is for online booking, and Italy Magazine, which is literally an online magazine for people who are interested in the Italian Dolce Vita way of life. Now, what is common to all of this is we need to think quite extensively about what is the strategy regarding content and how do you explain that to the people that are actually going to build the sites. So you need some common ground there. And content strategy has been growing in popularity over time. And it is very interesting to see the various attempts to kind of try to translate that to Drupal site building. So hopefully this is going to help along the process. Now, before we actually go into the details of how we map the two things, let's define content strategy. And as Jam mentioned, I did this presentation in Austin, and I had this example there that I thought was kind of neat, so I'm going to rerun it here. So this is your typical Texas background, very austere, very dry, and we as a company, BlueSpark, showed along with our content, our presence, our logo, and that's kind of modern. BlueSpark logo doesn't necessarily fit with the Texas background, right? And we have a great designer that used to also be he loves doing t-shirt design, and he came up with this amazing BlueSpark logo specifically for Austin, right? And I think this perfectly captures what content strategy is about. You adapt your content. In this case, it's how do you say BlueSpark in Austin, Texas, to the context. And it's interesting to see that the interest in content strategy over time is directly related to the rise in different devices over time, right? And specifically here, I'm just showing smartphones, because smartphones have been the physical thing that very immediately showed people that their websites actually are not going to work in the smartphone context. So they actually need to think about how they're going to shape their content to be able to serve it on different devices. And this was a bit of a shock for people. Now, out of that came the whole mobile-first approach to things, and very often kind of the concept of content strategy is kind of conflated into mobile first, and I always make a point of saying that should not be the case. What you really want to be thinking about is content everywhere, and don't get me wrong, mobile first is an extremely useful way of thinking of how you should design your pages, but it's so we're recording this, and it's September the 10th, right? And it's immediately after Apple just announced their Apple Watch, right? So that is a very good way to illustrate the limitations of thinking just mobile first, because what are you going to do now? Are you going to do watch first? You need to think content everywhere, and how my content can be as flexible as possible so I can serve it into as many different contexts as possible. And here's a great definition from a book that is actually called Content Everywhere. And it says, content strategy is the practice of understanding what content is needed to meet both users' needs and organizational goals, producing it, creating realistic publishing and governance plans to keep it that way. Right? And there's lots of other definitions out there. I think this captures most of it very well. Now, the challenge here, and this is kind of going to be a recurring theme, is that in order to achieve all these different things, produce content, have it meet different types of goals, manage its publication, have governance plans, and so on, you have to think across a whole number of different disciplines. So information architecture, user experience, content management, editorial management, so on and so forth, till it all translates into actual business or organizational goals. And that is hard, but it's just the nature of how we build things these days. It's extremely interdisciplinary. And in a way, what I'm trying to say is that the other thing that needs to be included here is the actual site building, especially in the context of Drupal, right? You need to think about Drupal site building as a related discipline. So, okay, so we're going to content strategize all the things, and it kind of cuts across so many different disciplines. At a certain point, we will need to be able to say, well, did this actually work? And I think another very useful way of defining something is to define what success looks like. So, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you think content strategy is, or how do you put it in a single phrase. It matters that you've gained this result. So the very first one, content is not bound to a page, right? It's not bound to an HTML page. It's flexible and it's future ready, and that's hard. Can we provide the content that best stands a chance to fulfill users' goals given context? Again, a huge, hard requirement. Can we find, use, share, and repurpose content easily? Is the message and the editorial vision clear? People should be, through the language you use and how you place it on the page, it should be clear what company's culture is, in a way. Can the content creators actually enjoy the process of creating content? And this is something that we find over and over again is people have some tools in place, but they just don't use them because it's so absolutely annoying to use them. And you can try and apply any number of different company rules that force people to do certain things. If it's not actually gratifying to do it, they're not going to do it. And finally, are there metrics in place? How do we know it works? Did this translate into more time on page, into more sales, into more whatever your metric of success is? So that's content strategy, right? That's what content strategists are trying to achieve, kind of meet all these different goals. Now let's talk a bit about Drupal site building, and then we will connect the two. And I would just like to point out that the Leaning Tower of Pisa here is not a comment on the state of Drupal site building. It's actually a comment on the ability of content, in this case the tower, to adapt to its context, ground morphology that causes it to lean, right? So this is successful content strategy. Because if it was not leaning, it would just be the Tower of Pisa, and it's very nice, but I doubt a lot of people will go visit it. Just wanted to clear that up. Okay, so I went on Drupal.org and looked for a definition of what is Drupal site building, and there's actually a definition there. It says it's implementing business functionality and features into your Drupal site, which is a huge definition. It's essentially everything. Now, in practical terms, in the type of things that Drupal site builders do every day, it's thinking of the structure and creating the content types and vocabularies and views and panels and menus that your Drupal site is going to have. And another huge part of this is taming the thousands of modules that are available to us as as site builders, to kind of stitching them together, configuring them so that they work and in a coherent way to perform useful functionality, right? And because I'm kind of a visual person, I also like to illustrate this with pictures. So this is my view of Drupal. It gets you from A to B, you and whatever you choose to load into it from A to B. And what content strategy is supposed to help you understand how to do is exactly how are you going to dress your Drupal up, right? So you can go for kind of very interesting statement on maximizing space in this case. You can make statements about exactly what your demographic is and the type of people you're after, or you could just have a bad idea, but it's still fun. So kind of Drupal is a vehicle. Content strategy is going to define how you're going to load it up and how it's going to get your message from point A to point B. And the person that's going to help you do that is the Drupal site builder. Now, the problem, I think, is it's kind of a terminology problem here, and words are important. A builder is typically a person that gets a complete set of instructions, obviously very skilled, obviously knows their domain very well, but gets a complete set of instructions and is supposed to implement those and deal with kind of situational problems. That's different from an architect, which gets an abstract definition of a problem. So something like, I would like to be able to publish recipes and allow people to search for those recipes in a number of different ways by difficulty, ingredients, and so on. And you actually need to translate that into a structure that allows content creators to create those recipes and users to search and find those recipes and so on. in this case, you are actually an architect. You have to think of kind of a wide range of concerns. You have to implement them in a way that's going to work today and is going to work in the future as the structure of recipes change. So Drupal site builders are actually Drupal architects, and maybe we should kind of start using that term a bit more. Because, again, it's very interdisciplinary. You have to think of almost exactly the same things, right? And it's the reason I just repeated this slide is it's important to make sure that any walls between these different roles are kept as absolutely low as possible. Ideally, you'd have everyone in a single team, and that's perfect. But let's just say, they're kept as low and as transparent as possible. Right? So from the very start, Drupal site builders and content strategies and everyone else involved in the process need to be able to talk about what their concerns are, how the things can be solved, and they need to have a common vocabulary, a common way of describing things. Because, again, you're forced to do all the things, and unless other people are getting where you're coming from, it can lead into problems and time wasted and so on. Okay, so we have a concept of what content strategy is and what content strategy is trying to achieve. We have a concept of what Drupal site building is and what it's trying to achieve. Now what I'd like to do is talk about how we model the world in Drupal. And essentially, the idea here is to give content strategists a sense of what is possible within Drupal, and to give site builders a set of principles plus specific tools that they can use to build sites in a way that they can actually express sophisticated content strategy. And after we do this, then we're going to go and look at how we applied all these things in a specific example, which is going to be Italy Magazine. Now, as ever, since nothing actually has very clear and precise rules, you need to start from principles. And the even harder part of principles is you need to find the balance between things. So while we should always favor abstraction and modularity, and if that is done appropriately, it can lead to fantastic things, we should also be careful about not taking it too far and a bit too abstract, because then we are actually not left with very much. And there's, unfortunately, there's just no mathematical proof about I have now built the correct site. And I was actually thinking about this as I was preparing the slides, and there's always the comparison down between software engineers, or in this case, let's call them Drupal engineers, and bridge builders. And I say, oh well, bridge building has been going on for centuries. They know their stuff. Software engineers just don't know their stuff. And that's not even a fair comparison, right? Because at the very least, if you're building a bridge, you can set up a simulation, and you can actually figure out if 1,000 cars go over this bridge at a certain speed and a certain weight in certain weather conditions and so on, will this bridge hold? And you actually get an answer, yes or no. And it's going to be a very good representation of what's going to happen in reality. You just cannot do that with a site. It's a far more complex thing. And you can run all the user surveys you want and all the focus groups and so on, still, there's not going to be a precise answer. So it's much more important to fall back on principles and best practices. And in the case of site building, I think there's kind of three important things. Stick to a core set of tools. Drupal has thousands of modules, and there's a module for everything, and that's fantastic. But it doesn't mean that every site that gets built needs to have a different set of modules running that site. There's actually a very good core set of contrib modules that can get you a long way along the path. And so I'm thinking of things like views and panels and CTools library and so on. And there are then modules that build on top of those. So try to keep everything within the same set of ideas. Balance flexibility with complexity, and that's a hard thing. But at least what we have that maybe bridge builders don't have that much, we can actually build the real thing and break it and then build it again and break it without a huge cost. They need their simulations because they couldn't actually build bridges all the time. So build prototypes, test them, break them, test them with the team, with the actual people that are going to be using them, and test them in the real context of, in this case, the content that is going to be in the site. And there's actually, if you look about the whole lorem ipsum debate online, you will find blog posts that say lorem ipsum is the devil. You'll find blog posts that say lorem ipsum is the best thing ever, and everything in between. And as ever, the answer lies in the in between. So lorem ipsum is useful, but if the only thing that was in your site up until the point that the site is in production was lorem ipsum, you will probably run into trouble. And it is a challenge to get developers to get excited about inputting real content because they have, in the Drupal world, we have devel generate, and it's going to generate 100 nodes for me, and it's going to put the text and the images and everything, and I'm fine. It works. Look at it. But that is not actually proof that it works. You have to pass it by the real content and have the actual content creators test the process. And it doesn't need to be an involved, long process. It can literally be, here's a very early prototype. Keep in mind that it's an early prototype. Do your thing. Build your content. What are the issues? What are you not understanding? So, take care about just falling back on lorem ipsum. Take advantage of core Drupal functionality, right? So we talked about this from the perspective of just the range of modules that can be used. But the other side of it is that ultimately Drupal is just a very flexible data modeling tool. So you start with entities that were introduced in Drupal 7 and very flexible field API, and you can and then Drupal uses these things to describe its own data units, so things like nodes and comments and files and users and so on. And then you have contrib modules bringing in other units of data, like commerce will bring in products. You have the profile module, you have beans, and you can build your own entities. And what is nice about all this is that it's all based on the same set of concepts. So and this is actually a great representation of managing complexity and flexibility. You can build very flexible, very complex things that are flexible, but the base set of concepts is simple and it remains the same. And whenever you go into actually thinking of completely custom data structures, that's when you're kind of you're just not taking advantage of the tool you have at your disposal. And it's at this point, with what is possible to model with Drupal, it's actually it would have to be a very strange situation where you actually have to think of a custom data structure and you cannot describe it to Drupal as a custom entity at the very least. So you have this modeling tools. The next step is to start thinking of the structure of your data and the relationships between different elements and how they work. And the beauty of it is, you can spend some time doing a sketch and kind of drawing the lines and doing the thinking of the relationships. And in pretty much the same amount of time or even less, you can actually build it and see how it behaves. And once you have that in place, and and this is something that content strategists will immediately relate to, right? So you can go to them and say, okay, so you want a story thing, and it has this fields, it has a title and a teaser and a body. What this location tag, what should that exactly be? How should that exactly look? And you can literally show them on the side. Do you want this to be a vocabulary? Is this going to be hierarchical? What are the restrictions around this data? So you can very quickly derive what the actual content model will be, and it can be a very flexible one. And once you have a good idea of what that would be, then you can start making it more sophisticated. So for every bit of data, you start thinking, okay, how should that data be expressed both within the database and in terms of the widget that people are going to use to insert the data on the site. And again, this is something that content strategists, sometimes they simply assume that this is not possible or this is just going to be too hard. And it's important to understand that when using Drupal as a modeling tool, a lot of those assumptions may not actually hold. And they will be able to see that if they get to play around with a prototype or if you spend some time sharing this information. You can use things like field collections to group related fields together, and there's it's probably hundreds rather than dozens of field specific modules that just let you express different data structures in a very concise way. And there's it's literally a game now. You're going through a project and you think of a field that you would like. And a couple of days ago, we're thinking, well, we need to express dimensions. I wonder if there is a dimensions field module that would do that. And the bet is I'm just going to type drupal.org/project/ what I would have called that module if I created it myself. And invariably, the module is going to pop up and it does the thing you wanted it to say. So in this case, it was, /project/ dimensions, and it was there, a field ready for you to express, width and height and area and so on. Then, in addition to modules that actually let you build different types of fields, you have just add-on modules that kind of let you play around with the whole, with the widgets or how the widgets behave, or how the fields relate to each other. So, for example, something like conditional fields, where you can have one field based on the value of another field and so on. And it's both the job of a Drupal architect / site builder is to know about all these possibilities, and then to communicate that to content strategists, because that's actually going to open up all sorts of possibilities that, as I said before, content strategists might have just been kind of self-regulating themselves in terms of how much it would be possible to do. Because with a lot of CMSs, it's still a challenge, to go from a single text area to a rich set of fields. Okay, so once you have your data model in place and your relationship between things, and you have the right widgets and so on, another pain point is formatting kind of larger pieces of text, right? And I'll just very quickly go through this simply by saying you need to think of what is the appropriate range between, absolute freedom, which would be full HTML, absolute austerity, right? They just can't do anything other than write text, no formatting. And there are cases where this is the best solution, especially since you can kind of break content up in lots of small individual pieces, and then can have precise formatting tools that get rules that get applied afterwards. And finally, balancing the kind of between choice and freedom, right? And whenever an editor is added, and editors are kind of a pain point because they just open up so many possibilities, keep in mind that you can just restrict that editor using Drupal modules that let you do this to just the specific buttons that the user needs to worry about. So in this case, this is something for kind of a community forum. And really, we wanted to keep it very simple. All they needed was, some basic formatting, links, and emoticons, and that was it. Okay. Again, a few modules you want to look into for improving formatting and improving how the information about formatting is passed to the user. And one of the challenges of this is, one of the many challenges, is so you get a content strategist together and a Drupal site builder, and and they start talking about their data model, and we could break it down into all these individual bits, and yeah, it would be fantastic. It's kind of, there's never going to be like a paragraph of text. Everything is going to be single words that are going to be joined together, and that's kind of the dream of content strategists, right? Because that's the way they can actually move content around and have it display anywhere when it's really broken down into its most essential elements. But then you have the content creators that get presented with this form of 60 fields that they have to fill in. So again, it's striking that balance between, yes, breaking it down into small pieces of data that can be reshaped in 100 different ways, but not that much that it actually becomes impossible for content creators to work with it. Now, this is the last thing we'll talk about in terms of modeling data, is categorization. And this is, again, an area where Drupal excels simply because it gives you so many different ways to do it. So that the first thing you can do is actually have a multiple option list field, right? And that has its, at times it has its benefits. It's, if we're dealing with something that's never going to change, it's very small, we're not interested in generating kind of additional pages for this automatically, but only if we actually want to do it. We want to make sure it's always going to be consistent. Then this is a great choice. Kind of a step beyond it is using something like tags. So in this case, it's open-ended. Users, as they're creating content, can just define lots of different tags. The challenge here is that consistency quickly becomes an issue, right? So you're going to have tags that are ever so slightly different between them, but they're actually about the same concept. So it's kind of, you need to come up with strategies of managing tags over time, whether it's just occasionally going in and cleaning things up, or putting rules in place and guidelines for content creators. Or you can have, fixed vocabularies, so that this gives you better control. You can do things like hierarchy. You can have fields associated to vocabulary terms, and of course, this you can have it with tags as well. And that suddenly turns this single words into actually a potentially complex and sophisticated piece of content in their own right, and we'll show you how we use that on the example site, Italy Magazine. But then you can also do things like flags. Flags is another way to categorize content. You can allow users to create arbitrary lists of things, driven purely by their own criteria of how content is related. And you can use things like organic groups to group content, not just in terms of the concepts the content is talking about, which is what vocabularies would be more about, but how you deal with content in terms of permissions, or in terms of a community that's able to access this content and create this content. So when modeling how your domain is going to look within the Drupal site, keep in mind that there is this full range of options, and it's worth kind of going through that discussion and saying, okay, how would this look if we did it with A or B or C and so on. And again, there's a whole bunch of very useful modules, especially in terms of managing taxonomy terms that can grow and quickly feel, that you can quickly feel you've lost control over your vocabularies, but modules like taxonomy manager and taxonomy merge and taxonomy tools will give you all those little utilities to deal with large amounts of vocabulary terms quickly. And finally, don't forget that it's not just people that are going to be viewing these things. There are machines that are going to be ingesting all this content, and luckily with Drupal, we already have the modules in place that will allow us to feed the machines. Okay, so we have the content strategist concerns, the Drupal site builders concerns, and this wide range of tools that allow the two together to express their domain, right? You have entities and fields and widgets that allow you to put information into fields, and modules that allow you to limit how people can interact with fields, and then ways to categorize data. So it's actually a very rich tool set. Right. Now let's see how this can work in practice. And what I'm going to talk about is work we've done with Italy Magazine. Italy Magazine it started publishing in '99, and in 2009 became a digital-only publication. So it had a huge amount of content, and we kind of relaunched it about a year ago now. And the first thing we did is go through all this variety of content that it had over time and the different content types, and did a content audit. And if you're dealing with existing sites, this is an extremely useful exercise to do, even though it takes time, right? Because depending on the structure of the site and the depth and breadth of content and how that's tied into traffic statistics and so on, it can take some fiddling to get all the information out, but it's extremely useful to then be able to see what types of content are actually relevant, what works, what doesn't work, and have a sense of where you can go next based on this. And we broke it down in terms of simple things like number of nodes, but also types of fields that were used, and how much traffic different types of nodes attracted based on the topic, and so on and so forth. So with a content audit in place, and then a sense of what are we trying to achieve as an organization, what are the user goals, some personas in terms of the types of people that are currently viewing the site, and the types of people that we actually want to view the site, so that the demographics we want to grow. We discussed what content we should continue producing and how the content should all be related between it, and came up with a content model, right? And in this case, we kind of have four large categories. The most interesting being kind of original content. So this is content that journalists produce for Italy Magazine, and community content that members of Italy Magazine actually produce. But then you also have things like listings and resources and just general pages and so on. And just being able to see the relationship between things like this, and you'll notice that all this content has two things that tie together, location and topic. Because a big thing right from the start in terms of organizational goals for Italy Magazine has been that we should be able to slice the information on Italy Magazine down to the smallest town in Italy, right? So you should be able to kind of create pages that pull in all location related to a specific location, and then be able to do that with topics as well. So whether it's food and drink or culture or fashion, you should be able to say, I want to see fashion in Florence versus I want to see food and drink in Milan versus I want to see, culture in Sicily overall. So that came from content strategy, and the way that Drupal site builders were able to translate that into an actual site is saying, okay, so we're going to have this big vocabularies that are kind of anchors across all content. Then, I already talked a bit about this. We, our different content categories and types. So I'll just skip that one. Common vocabularies, and here is an example of how it actually got implemented. So you have the vocation vocabulary, which is fixed, hierarchical, and then we added fields to it, and just went to Wikipedia and got lots of basic information about every single place in Italy, so that we would be able to play with it, like just coordinates and population numbers and the actual Italian name and so on and so forth. Topics, on the other hand, is a far more structured vocabulary, very carefully managed. There's actually a discussion before a topic is introduced, while tags is much more open-ended, and our current strategy is to kind of review it every so often. Plus, we have a set of guidelines in place for people to follow when they're thinking of tags. And this allows you to do things like at the end of every story, say, the topic of the story was, it's talking about the city and the city on the Med in this case, and the locations mentioned in the story are the Amalfi Coast and Positano, and you can actually click on those things and go see places to stay on the Amalfi Coast or Positano, or experiences or homes for sale, and that directly translates into what the content strategy needs were that express the business needs of actually driving people from content into, booking places to stay or getting in touch with estate agents in order to buy property. And I mentioned recipes before, so I just wanted to talk about the structure of Recipes on Italy magazine and how we used the tools available from Drupal to build something that is very flexible. So when a recipe is created, you have a field group, and we broke that down into the actual ingredient, and the actual ingredient is a vocabulary. So there's a vocabulary of ingredients. So you put in the ingredient, then you put in the quantity. This means that you can have a recipe page where you see all the ingredients, but then clicking on an ingredient, you can see all the other recipes that have that same ingredient. Right? So this makes it much more interactive. It increases time on site, and again, satisfies those content strategy goals. And because we've tied everything in with locations, we can also say, if this is a recipe from Abruzzo, we can pull in cooking schools from Abruzzo and tell you where, you can go there and visit and actually try that recipe in its natural context. And the way this is going to look for the content creator is actually relatively simple, right? If anything, they gain in that they don't have to type every ingredient. It's this vocabulary that just grows on its own. Finally, let me talk about user-generated content, because we have a community section, and this is the most challenging part, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of thinking of content strategy. Because while people that belong to an organization, work for the company, they can all reason and get excited about why you should tag content or categorize content. Once you come to an actual community, there's this tension between wanting them to get in and be able to do everything as quickly as possible, versus actually the huge benefit that everyone would gain from them just spending 15 seconds extra and defining those topics and locations. So what the solution we put in place is to have a first very simple area where they can enter their questions and just drop some images in order to upload them together with their questions. And then we're literally trying to motivate them with copy. So saying, there's just one more step and you'll be done, and please add this extra bit of information because it's going to help the community, right? So you're participating in this community, you're gaining from it. If you actually tell people what place you're talking about and what's the topic, it's going to be of a huge help. And we try to simplify the interface of doing this. And that actually works really well, in that most of our community posts are categorized by the community itself, and we can create richer experiences because of that. So now let me talk about how, after you've done all this work, you've built the various content types and the relationship between them and so on, how you can enjoy the result, right? So the first thing we do is in this Pinterest world of ours, we have landing pages which are just streams of content. And this allows us to tie together different types of content. Each one knows how it's supposed to visualize itself in this stream. And it's either tied together because of topic or because of location, or in the case of the front page, because of popularity. So there's a direct connection between back-end statistics and what content is actually popular or trending at the moment, and that gets surfaced on the front page. So the front page is constantly changing on the basis of what's popular. And we've used Node Queue extensively for this. We can take advantage of the great integration Drupal has with the Solr search engine and allow people to really filter into content, breaking it down into all the different topics and locations and tags and so on. I talked about the recipe section. Again, tying that in with Solr lets you facet and break it down, and you see the results directly. You see how much more time people spend on these pages. And finally, we can, as I stated before, one of our goals was to create this landing pages for every single place in Italy. So you can literally go italymagazine.com/name of a place or town or region or province, and you get a rich page with all sorts of different content about that page, whether it's content that our journalists have produced, or whether it's community content, or whether it's properties for sale, and so on. And at the same time, we can allow users using Flag to generate their own lists so that they can keep track of the things that interest them on Italy. And finally, we're taking advantage of the flexibility of this data to feed machines, as I talked before. Let's say the integration with Facebook was so quick, it was almost ridiculous. But it has also been quite simple to turn our nodes into JSON that's going to be feeding mobile apps that we're working on to be able to browse properties in Italy or generally the information we have. All of this because we've started from a solid content model that actually expresses business needs, and where you had content strategy working together with site builders to figure out what is the best way to achieve all this. Okay, so we have all our content there. The last bit is how do we produce it and how do we share it, right? So the first thing, which I already mentioned, is show the author some love. If the experience is a negative one, it's just not going to happen. And there are very small, effective things that can be done to help authors. And it's not necessarily about a very sleek interface that's kind of shiny and looks great. It's just thinking of how the process they go through to create content, thinking of image cropping, and to what extent can you help them with that, entering fields and not entering information into fields and not being worried that it's going to go wrong, and so on. Then think about how much workflow you actually need, and this is a point that I always enjoy making, and it's the thing that kind of really drove it home to me is, and this kind of heresy to bring this up in this context, maybe Jam is just going to cut this out, is there was this interview that I saw years ago between, there was Dries, founder of Drupal, and Matt, founder of WordPress, and they were kind of talking about Drupal and WordPress and all the great things that they can each do, and it was very friendly and nice. And at one point, Dries was saying, what is great about Drupal is you can go into an enterprise and figure out what their workflow is and what their process is, and Drupal can actually express that because we have the tools in place to do that. And that was great. Drupal is very powerful. It can't do that. What Matt said, for obvious reasons, but it's actually a very good thing, he said, well, when we go into an organization and they talk to us about, their very complex workflow and why stories need to go through 3 different levels of editors and need 5 different types of approval, we say, well, why do you need all these things? You don't need them, actually. Think about your process and how you can simplify it versus just being happy that you can express complex processes within Drupal. Now, it's actually great, and it's much better to be able to express complex processes. However, that doesn't mean that you need them. So within the context of Drupal, where we can do anything we want to do, and we have great tools like Workbench that let us do these things, we actually need to make sure that we don't get too excited about it, and we keep it as simple as possible. Oh, and sorry, just at the time I had originally prepared the slides, Google authorship was still considered a great thing to have, right? You could actually tell Google who is the author of this thing. Google has since dropped the authorship information from its from its search results. Now you can still tell it, and it will pick that information up, but it's not actually going to show it, and it's not clear what's going to happen in the future. So yeah, just keep that in mind when thinking of the Google authorship module. Now, the other thing is, when and how to expose content, right? To tell people that there is content on your site. So you need to study user behavior, take care of timing, have an editorial calendar. And in a weird way, for a magazine that's just like Italy Magazine, it's just an obvious thing. You prepare content every day. You need to plan what content you're going to have this week and what content or what style of content you're going to have 3 weeks from now. It's much harder if it's a different type of site, like a company site with a blog, where people are expected to kind of do things as and when they can because of their general enthusiasm. And what you'll find is very often that's not going to happen. So in those cases, it's even more important to have an editorial calendar so that people have a sense of what's coming up and preparing for it. Something that can sting is, especially when you're using automated tools to publish things and push it out to social media and so on, is make sure you figured out how and when things get cached, especially in Drupal scenarios where you have different levels of caching. You have the Drupal cache, and then you have Varnish cache, and so on. You may find that when you hit publish, that's not necessarily when everything is actually available, or maybe there's a different version there and so on. So make sure that there's solutions to all these things, and there's you just need to make sure that you think through it. And finally, as you're doing all this, make sure that you know what you're going to need to measure. User behavior these days is very complex, especially because sites are not just sites in and on their own. They're fundamentally extensions of social media. And typically the way you're going to drive people to a site is you're going to post it on Twitter or Facebook and so on. And users are not necessarily immediately going to kind of explore your site more. So you need to have a clear concept of how they behave and what you're achieving to do with specific types of content. And kind of a good example from the Italy Magazine domain is we post these quizzes, right? So it's kind of trying to guess different things about Italy. In this case, is showing people different pictures of pizzas, and they need to guess what's the Italian name of that pizza. And you can actually, you would not get extra page views here because it's all on a single page, but we still wanted to measure how successful the quiz was, right? How many people took it. And there's no concept of logging in to do it and so on. So you can use things like events that get registered in Google Analytics that will literally let you know how many times people clicked on each individual button. And this way you have a sense of, producing quizzes is actually a good idea. Let's do more of them, or it didn't work. Let's not do it anymore. Now, the final piece is something that we're currently working on within BlueSpark, and hopefully we'll be talking about it much more, is kind of placing content strategy and site building into a much wider engagement strategy, where you're measuring positive or negative interactions across your site and across social media, with the starting point being who are you trying to engage, how are you trying to engage with them, and what are the specific actions, whether it's sharing on Twitter or filling in a form on your site, that lead to a positive result. So that's I think where it's kind of, as a community, we went from thinking about just building sites and kind of trying to figure that part out, and we're doing a very good job at that. And now we're opening it up a bit more, and we're thinking much more about user experience and content strategy, and that's showing up in conferences, and that's fantastic. The next step is engagement, and actually, it's very good that Dries has been using his keynotes, and Acquia has been producing tools that talk specifically about and deal with the wider experience management of concerns, and that's definitely kind of the next step that we need to go as a community as a whole. Great. Thank you very much for kind of listening through all of this.
Hey, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for presenting that. There was a ton of really, really valuable information in that, and I'm really, really glad that we managed to do this. Let me see. And it's not very nice of you, however, to put those food photos so near the end. By the time you were talking about the recipes, I was really, So anyway, great. So Ronald, I almost called you Istos, which I
everyone does.
Your last name.
It's my Twitter handle.
Ronald Ashri, CTO of BlueSpark Labs, thank you for doing your content strategy session on my virtual Drupal camp. I really, really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to seeing you somewhere in person soon. And yeah, any last words for us?
Thanks for having me, man. It's been great.
Cool. Okay. So that was Ronald's Jams Drupal camp session. Catch you next time on the Acquia Podcast.